The local paper ran her picture again, smiling beside Ted Miller, shaking hands over some new community initiative, while my own name wasn't even mentioned in the article. Later, at the grocery store, old Mrs. Henderson stopped me. "Isn't your wife quite the busy woman, Frank?" Her knowing look made my stomach knot. That night, Carol simply said, "Some people just understand ambition." Frank guided his old Ford F-150 into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. The sight of Carol's Honda CR-V, parked neat and centered, caught his eye. It was Tuesday, barely 4 in the afternoon. She wasn't usually home this early. The afternoon sun, already softening towards evening, cast long shadows across the small front lawn he'd mowed just Saturday. He cut the engine. The sudden quiet of the truck, feeling oddly loud. The house, usually alive with the television or Carol's music by this hour, was unnaturally still. The front door was unlocked, a habit he sometimes forgot. She never did. As he stepped inside, the familiar, expensive scent of her jasmine perfume hit him. Usually, it was a comforting smell, a sign of her presence, but today it felt thick, almost cloying in the silent air. It hung heavy around the entryway, out of place in the quiet. "Frank?" Her voice, typically clear and bright, drifted from the kitchen. There was a careful, almost rehearsed quality to it he hadn't heard before, a slight tremor underneath the calm. A tightness began to gather in his chest. He left his work boots by the door, took off his cap, and walked through the living room, the wood floors cool beneath his socks. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a simple pine rectangle they'd bought when they first moved in. Carol wore her charcoal suit, the one she saved for important meetings at the bank, not for Tuesdays at home. Her hands were wrapped around a mug, steam curling faintly from its rim, but he knew she hadn't taken a sip. She never drank hot tea, not in the afternoon. Her gaze was steady, fixed on the space between them as he approached. He pulled out the chair across from her, the plastic sliders scraping softly against the floor. Before he could sit fully, she reached across the table, taking his hand. Her fingers were surprisingly cold against his calloused skin. "Frank," she began, her voice low, a careful cadence in each word. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about our marriage lately." The air in the room seemed to thicken. He waited, the faint scent of jasmine and something else, something clinical, filling his nostrils. "Ted Miller," she continued, easing her hand away, her gaze now fixed on the mug. "You know Ted from the planning committee, don't you? His wife, Brenda. She's been really ill these past few years. It's taken a toll on their marriage, on him." She paused, took a shallow breath. "He told me they haven't been intimate in a long time." A cold weight settled in Frank's gut, heavy and dense. He watched her, a knot forming in his stomach, anticipating where this was going. He didn't want to anticipate it. He tried to tell himself he was wrong, that it was something else, anything else. "I want to help him," she finally said, her eyes meeting his, unnervingly clear. Physically, he stared at her, unblinking. His mind searched for the punchline, the subtle smirk that would reveal the joke, but her expression was serious, expectant. Her gaze held his, unwavering. The blood seemed to drain from his face, leaving a cold hollowness. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "You want to help him? Physically?" he repeated slowly, the words feeling foreign and absurd on his tongue. "Yes," she affirmed, her voice a little stronger now. "It's not an affair, Frank. This isn't about hiding anything. It's an open, honest decision, one I'm including you in." She gestured with her hand, as if laying out a blueprint. "I believe it could make our marriage stronger, more resilient." She picked up her mug, then set it back down, untouched. Frank's chair scraped back violently across the floor, the harsh sound echoing in the silent kitchen. He pushed himself to his feet, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Stronger?" His voice was a raw, disbelieving bellow. "You want to sleep with another man, and you think it will make our marriage stronger?" His eyes burned into hers, demanding an explanation that made sense, any sense at all. Carol didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, her composure unsettling in the face of his anger. "If you would just sit down and discuss this rationally, Frank," she said, her voice smooth, almost condescending. "You're not even trying to understand what I'm saying." His gaze swept over her, taking in the formal suit, the calm face, the untouched mug. The air was thick with the jasmine, suffocating him. He turned abruptly, heading for the counter where he'd tossed his keys. The jingle of the metal in his hand was loud in the tense silence. "I need some air," he declared, his voice tight, controlled. "I need to not be here right now." Frank drove, the pickup's engine a steady hum beneath him, but he wasn't going anywhere in particular. He passed rows of identical brick houses, their windows glowing with the amber warmth of evening lamps. Children rode bikes on driveways. A sprinkler rotated lazily across a manicured lawn. Normal lives, Frank thought, the kind he used to believe he had. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, stark shadows across the asphalt. He didn't want to go home, but there was nowhere else to go. He drove until the familiar streets gave way to a less familiar part of town, near the old industrial park. He pulled into the gravel lot of a place called the Rusty Nail, a bar he'd driven past 100 times but never entered. It was dimly lit, the neon beer signs in the windows casting lurid colors onto the wet asphalt. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried food. A few patrons sat hunched over their drinks, each a solitary island. He took a stool at the far end of the bar. "Double whiskey. Neat," he told the bartender, a man with tired eyes and thinning hair, who wiped the counter with slow, deliberate movements. "Long day." "Huh?" the bartender asked, placing the glass in front of him. Frank took a deep gulp, the liquid burning a path down his throat. "Something like that," he managed, his voice rough. "Wife problem." The bartender, Dale, nodded, a practiced sympathy in his expression. "Women are complicated, friend," he said, before moving to serve another customer. The platitude did nothing to ease the knot in Frank's stomach. It was more than complicated. It was grotesque. The word sat in his mind, sharp and cold, like a stone. He thought about just leaving, packing a bag, getting in the truck, and driving until the gas ran out. But where would he go? To Debbie's? He couldn't dump this on his sister. He thought about going back, storming into the house, demanding an explanation that made sense. But he knew Carol would simply reiterate her calm, rational points, making him feel like the unreasonable one. Or he could just accept it. This new, horrifying reality. Live with it. Let her help Ted Miller. And maybe, somehow, their marriage would become stronger. As she claimed, the thought made him feel sick to his stomach. Each option was a dead end. He ordered another, then another. The whiskey numbed the edges of his shock, blurring the sharp lines of betrayal into a dull, throbbing ache. The bar sounds, the distant clinking of glasses, the low murmur of voices, all faded into a background hum. He just sat there, swirling the amber liquid, watching the ice melt. He drank until his head felt heavy, and his thoughts, while still present, were slower, less urgent. It was late when he finally let himself back into the house. The jasmine scent was faint now, barely clinging to the air. The house was dark and silent. He found Carol in their bed, asleep on her side, facing away from him. The streetlight filtering through the blinds cast a soft glow on her face. It was a placid mask, serene and undisturbed. He looked at her, searching for something familiar, something he recognized, but all he saw was a stranger. He slipped under the covers on his side, careful not to jostle the mattress, not to touch her. The bed, once a shared space of warmth and intimacy, now felt like an unbridgeable chasm between them. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, the whiskey offering no true escape from the quiet dread that had settled deep in his bones. The next morning, the sun was already high when he finally dragged himself out of bed. Carol was in the kitchen, making coffee, setting out cereal. She moved with her usual efficiency, her charcoal suit replaced by a simple blouse and slacks. Breakfast was a silent affair, the clinking of spoons against bowls the only sound. She acted as if their conversation from yesterday had never happened, as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis. "We should revisit my proposal later," she said, finally breaking the silence, her voice calm, devoid of any hint of the storm that had raged in him. "When you're feeling less emotional," he only nodded, his throat tight. desperate to escape the house, to get away from the unspoken weight of her words. At work, he stared blankly at the computer screen, the numbers and charts blurring into meaningless patterns. Carol's words echoed in his mind. I want to help him. Physically, the simple, horrifying sentence played on a loop. He picked up the phone, dialing his sister, Debbie. Hey, Frank. Debbie's voice was bright, cheerful. Everything all right? Yeah, fine, he mumbled, then hesitated. Just some things with Carol. Marital stuff. He choked on the words, unable to force out the truth. How could he tell her? How could anyone believe it? Oh, Frank. You and Carol, 15 years, right? Talk to her. Don't let things fester, Debbie advised, her voice full of well-meaning concern. You gotta communicate. Don't give up so easily. Her practical, solid advice, given from the safe distance of normal problems, felt hollow, useless. He knew she would never understand. The smell hit him the moment he opened the front door. Roasted chicken, herbs, and something sweet. Like carrots simmering, it was Carol's signature peace offering, her way of mending things, or at least, pretending to. He walked into the kitchen to find the table set with their good china, the silver gleaming under the soft glow of the overhead light. Carol was at the stove, humming softly, her back to him. She looked up, offering a small, tight smile. Dinner was a quiet affair at first, punctuated only by the clinking of forks against plates. The roasted chicken was perfectly cooked, the potatoes crisp. Carol ate with her usual delicate precision. Frank picked at his food, the taste like ash in his mouth. He waited, knowing this elaborate meal wasn't just about apologies. Frank, she began. Finally, her voice calm, carefully modulated. We need to talk about this maturely. She laid her fork down, pushing her plate slightly aside. I've been reading a lot. About relationships. About what truly constitutes a fulfilling partnership. She looked at him directly, her eyes unwavering. It's about understanding our needs, about personal growth, about expanding our understanding of love beyond traditional, restrictive definitions. He felt a growing nausea, the rich smell of the food suddenly unbearable. She spoke of non-monogamy, ethical polyamory, as if she were discussing a new investment strategy. It's a modern approach, Frank, she explained, her voice gaining a confident edge, an enlightened choice for couples who truly want to deepen their connection, who aren't afraid to explore boundaries. Her words were clinical, a cold dissection of their life, of everything he thought they were. He listened, dumbfounded, as she laid out her logic, piece by precise piece. Then came the kicker. And with Ted, she said, her voice dropping slightly, it's not just physical. We've already developed an emotional connection, Frank. He has feelings for me. And I care for him too. Deeply. She met his gaze, unflinching. This isn't about me leaving you. This is about strengthening our bond, making us more complete, both individually and as a couple. Frank could only stare, the fork still halfway to his mouth. The cold realization hit him, a punch to the gut. Her honesty wasn't about including him. It was a preemptive strike, a way to absolve her guilt, to make him complicit before the act was even committed. She was presenting it as a done deal, a fait accompli, wrapping it in a veneer of sophisticated terminology and self-help rhetoric. He slammed his fist on the table, the china rattling, the wine glasses jumping. Commitment? His voice was hoarse, raw with disbelief and rage. You want to sleep with Ted Miller, and you call that commitment to our marriage? The words tasted bitter. She didn't flinch. Her hand reached across the table, her fingers cool as she tried to take his. Frank, I'm choosing to be honest with you. I'm not doing this behind your back. That's what true commitment looks like. He yanked his hand away, the movement sharp and abrupt. You're informing me, Carol, he retorted, his voice low and tight. You're not including me. He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. The smell of roasted chicken, of her expensive perfume, the suffocating air of her calculated persistence, it was all too much. He couldn't breathe. He turned, grabbing his keys from the bowl by the door without another word. He needed out. The sound of his truck engine roaring to life in the driveway was the last thing he heard before he backed out, leaving the warm glow of their home behind. He drove aimlessly again, the suburban lights blurring into streaks of color outside his window. Ashamed, enraged, and utterly alone, he couldn't bring himself to call anyone. He'd sleep on the couch later, if he could sleep at all. Days folded into weeks, each one stretching longer than the last. A chilling silence had become the third presence in their home, a heavy blanket draped over every room. Frank and Carol moved around each other, a tense truce holding them suspended in a fragile peace. He had moved his things into the guest room, the spare bed stiff and unfamiliar. The physical distance, the space between the twin beds pushed against the wall, felt like a necessary buffer against the emotional chasm that had opened up between them. Carol, however, remained undeterred. She kept up her quiet campaign, her arguments growing more refined, her persistence unwavering. She would leave articles about conscious coupling or open relationships on the kitchen counter, highlighted passages about personal fulfillment and expanded love. Sometimes, she'd approach him softly while he was watching television, suggesting they talk through his discomfort or explore the fears he was holding on to. One Saturday, they found themselves at the Petersons' annual barbecue, a tradition for nearly a decade. The air was thick with smoke from the grill and the easy chatter of neighbors. Ted Miller was there, of course, standing by the cooler, his laugh carrying across the yard. Frank watched, a phantom at his own table, as Carol drifted towards Ted, their heads inclined together, a shared glance, a small, knowing smile that passed between them. A private joke, something Frank wasn't privy to, a subtle intimacy he couldn't deny. Even as he chewed on a hot dog that tasted like ash, he felt like an intruder, a stranger observing his own wife in a delicate dance he hadn't been invited to, whose steps he didn't know. Occasionally, Carol would catch his eye across the patio, and a flash of something unreadable would cross her face. She would then make her way over to him, her hand resting briefly on his arm, her smile a little too wide as she asked, "Everything all right, honey?" It was a performance, Frank knew, for the watchful eyes of their friends, who likely saw nothing out of the ordinary, only a couple being pleasantly attentive. The touch felt cold, alien. Later that night, after they were home and the lingering smell of barbecue had settled in the house, she pressed him again. "Frank," she began, sitting on the edge of the guest room bed, her voice soft but firm. "This is about trust, about proving your love for me. It's a test, really, a path to deeper understanding, deeper trust between us." She spoke as if reading from a script, her eyes earnest. Exhaustion began to wear down Frank's outrage. The constant pressure, the relentless logic, had dulled the sharp edges of his anger, replacing it with a hollow ache. He felt a morbid, twisted curiosity about her determination, about how she could believe so firmly in this grotesque path. He was trapped, cornered. He saw it clearly now. He was losing her no matter what he did. If he refused, he'd be the unreasonable one, the one holding them back. And she would eventually leave anyway. Or worse, resent him forever. If he agreed, he'd lose a part of himself, a piece of his marriage he couldn't imagine living without. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the old window unit. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the woman he married, but a stranger with a plan. In a moment of utter defeat, his voice hollow, devoid of any fight left, he finally said, "Fine. Do what you want. But I'll hate it. I'll hate you for it." The words felt heavy, each one a stone sinking into the pit of his stomach. Carol's face softened, a small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief escaping her lips. The tension in her shoulders eased. "Thank you for understanding, Frank," she said, her voice gentle, almost tender. It was a chilling acceptance, a quiet victory that shattered what little remained of his spirit, leaving him empty, hollowed out. The affair, or arrangement as Carol insisted on calling it, began. The signs were subtle at first. Then, impossible to ignore. Carol started coming home later, the scent of her usual jasmine perfume, often overshadowed by a different, more expensive fragrance that clung to her clothes. a richer, muskier smell that wasn't hers. Sometimes, he'd find her humming softly to herself in the kitchen, a new, almost girlish lightness in her step. There was a vibrant energy about her, a confidence he hadn't seen in years, certainly not in the last few. She looked happier, and Frank felt a deep, cold void within himself. It was a silent scream that never left his throat, a constant pressure behind his eyes. He moved from the guest room to the couch, then back to the guest room. Their marital bed became a cold expanse. If she happened to brush against him in the hallway, he would instinctively recoil. The ghost of their past intimacy now a haunting presence. One evening, after she'd come home particularly late, humming a tune he didn't recognize, he finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. They were in the kitchen, washing dishes, a routine they had maintained for 15 years. "How's Brenda Miller doing?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual, almost conversational. Carol paused, her hands in the soapy water. "Brenda?" she said, a slight frown creasing her brow, as if surprised by the question. "Oh, you know, same as always. Ted says she's having another bad spell with her treatments." She rinsed a plate, then turned to him, her expression hardening just slightly. "Look, Frank, this isn't about Brenda. This is about Ted and me. Ted's a compassionate man, yes, but our arrangement is about mutual comfort. It's not about her illness." She said it with a clinical detachment that sent a shiver down his spine. Frank struggled to reconcile this callousness with the woman he had married. The woman who used to cry during sad movies, who organized food drives for the less fortunate. His Midwestern sense of right and wrong, solid and unyielding, screamed in protest. How could she speak of mutual comfort, while another woman, Ted's wife, lay ill, oblivious to this grotesque betrayal? He moved through his days like a zombie, performing his job at the plant, doing the yard work, fixing the leaky faucet. A mere observer in his own life, the world around him seemed to hum with an ordinary indifference that only intensified his isolation. He started drinking more heavily, the whiskey a temporary anesthetic against the constant thrum of betrayal, the quiet humiliation. The local bar became his sanctuary, a dark, quiet corner where no one knew his name or his shame. One Saturday, his sister Debbie dropped by unannounced, bringing a casserole. Her sharp eyes immediately noticed his withdrawn nature, the haggard appearance he tried to hide behind a forced smile. She followed him into the living room, setting the casserole down on the coffee table. "Frank," she said, her voice soft but firm. "What's wrong? You look like you haven't slept in weeks. And Carol, she just seems different." She sat beside him on the sofa, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You can tell me, you know. We're family," he almost told her. The words rose in his throat, a torrent of shame and rage, the grotesque truth threatening to spill out, but he clamped them down, biting the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood. How could he possibly unleash this horror on his sister? How could he explain that his wife, his Carol, was helping another man physically, all while Brenda Miller wasted away? The thought was too ugly, too unbelievable. "Just stress at work, Deb," he mumbled, pulling his arm away, rubbing his temple. "And you know Carol, she's always got some new project going on." Brief, vengeful fantasies flashed through his mind, confronting Ted, exposing them both, blowing up their carefully constructed world. But he dismissed them just as quickly. He felt utterly powerless. A cuckolded fool. Adrift in a reality he hadn't chosen. He was trapped. This much was clear. Frank's world was no longer his own, but a stage set for someone else's script. His quiet life, once predictable and solid, had become a complex web of deceit and unspoken truths. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. One night, Carol returned home, her presence filling the quiet house with a vibrant energy Frank hadn't seen directed at him in years. Her eyes sparkled as she recounted details of a new Thai restaurant downtown, the delicate spices, the crisp wines. Then, she spoke of a play she'd seen, a contemporary drama, with Ted. Her hands moved animatedly as she described the acting, the plot, her laughter light and genuine. As she gestured, Frank noticed a glint of new silver on her wrist. A watch, not the practical, slender one she usually wore to work, but something far more elegant, expensive-looking, catching the light as she moved. "New watch?" he asked, his voice flat, trying to hide the tremor of anger. She glanced down, almost dismissively. "Oh, this? Ted gave it to me. A work thing, for all the extra hours I've been putting in on the committee." Her explanation was delivered with a practiced ease, too smooth. A surge of bitter fury, cold and sharp, ignited within him. It was fueled by her casual disregard, her comfortable lies, and his mounting suspicion. "A work thing," he repeated to himself later that night, lying awake on the guest bed, staring at the ceiling. The phrase echoed in the hollow space of his skull, a mocking refrain. A cold resolve settled in his heart. The quiet agony, the doubt, the constant thrum of betrayal. It had become unbearable. He needed proof. Undeniable evidence. He needed to peel back the layers of her carefully constructed facade. He began to meticulously observe her routine. The late nights became more frequent. The excuses more elaborate. The sudden gym visits that stretched suspiciously long, ending with her smelling of fresh shampoo, but never sweat. He started leaving work early, parking his truck a few blocks from the house, just watching. One crisp autumn afternoon, he saw her pull out of the driveway in her white Audi. He waited a beat, then started his own truck, keeping a discreet distance, 2 cars between them, slowing when she slowed, turning when she turned. The drive was calm, almost peaceful. Until she pulled into the parking lot of a secluded coffee shop on the edge of town. A place he didn't recognize. Ted Miller's familiar silver sedan was already there, parked in a far corner. Frank watched as Carol got out, a small, expectant smile on her face. Ted was waiting by the door. Frank saw them greet each other, their hands clasping for a moment longer than necessary. Their heads came together, laughter echoing faintly even through the closed windows of his truck. It was an undeniable intimacy, playing out in broad daylight. His gut churned. He watched them for a while, sipping coffee, leaning close. Then they finished, got into Ted's car, and drove off. Frank followed, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. Ted drove to the other side of town, to a modest hotel, the kind with exterior doors opening directly to the parking lot. The kind used for discreet rendezvous, Frank thought, his stomach twisting into a knot. He pulled his truck into the shadow of a large oak tree across the street, cutting the engine. He watched, numb, as they walked side by side, Ted's hand brushing the small of Carol's back, disappearing into one of the rooms. He sat there, minutes turning into an hour, then 2, then 3. The sunlight shifted, the shadows lengthened. He felt nothing, yet everything. Just a hollow, empty ache. Finally, they reappeared. Ted opened the door for her, a small, tender gesture. Carol smiled, a soft, private smile meant only for him. As they walked to the car, Frank lifted his phone, his hand steady. The camera clicked, capturing the damning images of their arrival, their departure. Each photo was a stab to his heart, each one a piece of evidence. He drove home, the camera heavy in his pocket, a grim calm settling over him. The air in the truck was cold, the radio silent. He parked, walked into the quiet house, and sat in the living room, waiting for her return, waiting for the moment. Carol's Honda CR-V eventually pulled into the driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires. The headlights swept across the living room window before cutting out. Frank heard her keys in the lock, the soft click of the door. When she walked in, the jasmine perfume was there. Faint, but layered beneath it was the undeniable, sterile scent of cheap motel soap. Frank was waiting. He sat on the edge of the armchair. The coffee table before him, a stark landscape, scattered across its polished surface were the damning photos, printed in color, each one a stark, undeniable record. Ted's car, the hotel entrance, them walking in, them walking out, a silent death sentence. She saw them immediately. Her eyes, usually so quick to assess, flickered with a momentary surprise. A sudden catch in her breath. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his voice low, steady, devoid of emotion. "Explain this, Carol," he said, gesturing to the images. Her initial surprise quickly hardened into a familiar, defensive calm. She walked closer to the table, her gaze sweeping over the pictures, betraying nothing. She didn't deny a thing. She simply looked at him, her lips a thin line. "Frank," she began. Her voice, even, almost robotic. "We talked about this. This is part of the arrangement. The understanding you gave your consent to." The words hit him, cold and calculated. He felt a profound, chilling clarity. He was never included, only informed. He had been a passive participant in his own demise, a willing sacrifice on the altar of her personal growth. The last vestiges of his love, the lingering hope, crumbled, leaving behind only dust and an unbearable ache of betrayal. Without another word, he walked into their bedroom, the room that once held their shared life. He pulled a worn duffel bag from the closet and began to pack. A few shirts, a pair of jeans, his toothbrush, his worn leather wallet. His movements were deliberate, final. Carol had followed him, standing in the doorway, watching. The composure that had been her shield finally cracked. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight with panic, a tremor he hadn't heard since they were first married. He zipped the bag shut, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. He turned to her, his eyes cold, emptied of all affection. "I'm leaving, Carol. I'm done." She lunged forward, grabbing his arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Frank, please, don't do this. 15 years, Frank. Our life together, our dreams. You can't just throw it all away." Her voice was desperate now, a raw plea. He looked down at her hand, then back into her pleading eyes. His own felt like chips of ice. "You chose this," he stated, his voice flat, resolute. "You chose him. This is over." He gently, firmly, detached her hand from his arm. He walked past her, past the damning photos on the coffee table, out the front door, and into the cold night. He didn't look back. He drove to the first cheap motel he found on the highway, the silence of his truck, a heavy cloak around him. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. He sat on the edge of the bed, the phone heavy in his hand. He dialed Debbie. "Frank?" "Where are you?" Carol called. "She sounds hysterical." Debbie's voice was sharp with concern. "I left." "Deb," he said, the words finally tumbling out. "The dam broken." He poured out the entire horrifying truth. Everything. From Carol's proposition to the photos in his pocket, he told her about Brenda Miller, about the arrangement, about his utter desolation. His sister's furious disbelief, her cries of "I can't believe her," were a stark echo of his own numb despair. Frank spent the night in the impersonal motel room. The air conditioning unit hummed a monotonous tune, and the smell of industrial cleaner clung to everything. There was a strange mix of release within him, a lightness from shedding the suffocating pretense. But beneath it lay a crushing emptiness. He was free, yes, but free of everything he had built for 15 years. The silence of the room was heavy, more profound than the silence in his own house had ever been. The next day, Debbie was there, solid and unwavering. She drove him to the lawyer's office, her hand resting briefly on his arm as he walked through the door. His resolve was hardened by a cold, quiet anger that had replaced the raw anguish. He initiated divorce proceedings, the words feeling foreign, yet necessary, on his tongue. Carol, however, refused to go quietly. Her lawyer's letters began arriving. Each one, a calculated assault. She fought him on everything. The house, their modest savings, even the old gardening tools. Through her legal team, she painted herself as the bewildered victim, a devoted wife whose husband had inexplicably abandoned her, leaving her heartbroken and financially vulnerable. The true extent of her deception came to light during the initial financial disclosures. Frank sat with his lawyer, staring at the bank statements, his blood running cold. Carol hadn't just been planning for personal growth. She'd been systematically draining their joint accounts, funneling money into a separate, private account over the course of several months. The numbers laid it out, stark and undeniable. She had been preparing for this separation, securing her own future, while he remained oblivious. This discovery ignited a different kind of rage within him. It wasn't the fiery, emotional outburst from before, but something colder, more precise, and far more vengeful. She hadn't just broken his heart, she'd tried to break his future, to leave him financially gutted and alone. His earlier, fleeting thoughts of revenge, which he'd dismissed as childish spite, now solidified into a focused, destructive purpose. He felt a grim satisfaction in the clarity of his decision. He had nothing left to lose. He leveraged his own corporate finance experience. Late into the nights, alone in the quiet of his motel room, then in a small rental apartment, he began to meticulously investigate Ted Miller's company, Preston Associates. He pulled public filings, cross-referenced news articles, and dug through industry reports. He understood how shell companies worked, how funds could be rerouted, how books could be cooked. The numbers, cold and objective, began to reveal a story far more complex than a simple affair. He uncovered a web of financial irregularities. Inflated invoices, questionable foreign investments, offshore transactions with obscure entities. There were potential compliance breaches, hints of something far darker hidden beneath the polished surface of Preston Associates. This wasn't just poor management, it was systematic. Frank decided on a path of justice that would dismantle not just Ted, but possibly Carol too, for her calculated cruelty, for her casual disregard of everything they had built. He knew what he had to do. He made an anonymous call to an investigative journalist he'd seen on local news, a woman known for her tenacious reporting. His voice was calm, steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him, as he detailed the complex financial discrepancies he'd uncovered, pointing her to the key documents, the specific red flags. He laid out the breadcrumbs, enough to send a professional digging. He understood this choice would forever mark him, that it meant sacrificing a piece of his own morality, descending into a realm he never thought he'd inhabit. But he believed he had nothing left to lose. As he hung up the phone, a bitter, cold satisfaction settled over him. The price, he knew, would finally be paid. By all of them. The anonymous call landed like a stone in a still pond, ripples spreading far beyond Frank's immediate circle. The investigation into Preston Associates grew, revealing a tangled mess of corporate malfeasance that eventually led to indictments. Ted Miller's career crumbled, his name dragged through the local papers with accusations of fraud and malfeasance. Carol, embroiled in the legal fallout and facing her own financial difficulties from the divorce, saw her carefully built professional life disintegrate. Frank watched it all unfold from a distance, a silent observer to the chaos he had unleashed. There was no triumph, no elation, only a bitter, cold satisfaction that tasted like ash. He had sought justice, or perhaps simply retribution, and he had found it. But the victory felt hollow. He was alone, his home gone, his trust shattered beyond repair. The silence in his small apartment was absolute, a constant reminder of the life he'd lost, the man he'd once been. The price, he realized, had been paid by everyone, including himself. The cost of betrayal, for all involved, was absolute.